Hey folks, you're listening to the International Youth Climate Podcast. It is created by students participating in Fridays for Future and School Strike for Climate. Since this is our first episode ever recorded, we will give you a short summary of why we are here. As you may know, climate change is the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced, and it is a problem without borders. Together, we need to face this problem. Together, we need to strike. But striking isn't our only weapon. We need to share the knowledge we have. This is why we built this project, this podcast, to share the knowledge to the young people that are not being informed in school, to everyone who hasn't had time yet to inform themselves about it, and to those who have a hard time finding trustworthy sources. We want you to be better informed in each episode. Being informed means being able to discuss this problem with teachers, parents, the press, and politicians based on facts, on science. At the moment, we are 44 students from 22 countries creating this podcast. And if you want to join, you can write us a mail at internationalclimatepodcast@gmail.com. We hope you will enjoy this episode. Now, I hope if you're listening to this, you have at least a vague idea what this whole global warming thing is. But if not, we will go into it in depth shortly, so stay tuned. Right now, we are talking for a bit more than 60 seconds about the latest global news related to the environment. So give it up for our youngest speaker, 12 and just learning English. Here are our top 7.
In a huge blow for Australian nature lovers, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has been re-elected alongside the Labor Party in a recent federal election, having no politics whatsoever regarding climate change and environmental management. This seems to be a 3-year setback to any hopes of improving the dire state of our wild places. Following huge protests from the Extinct Rebellion group, the UK Parliament has officially declared a climatic emergency, showing its support for the activists and its intention to help solve the climate crisis. There has been a number of claimed sightings indicated that the Formosan clouded leopard is not actually extinct, as previously thought. Whilst currently unconfirmed, these sightings provide a glimmer of hope that this charismatic species hasn't completely disappeared yet. The initiator of the school strike for climate movement, Greta Thunberg, has been featured in the Times newspaper after having completed world first tour of European power, including speaking at the UN Climate Change Conference and World Economic Forum, meeting with the Pope and betraying the UK Parliament for their inaction on global warming. The European elections are taking place this Friday to Sunday. If you are living in the EU and are over 16 or 18, depending on where you live, make sure to make this election about climate change and vote pro-climate, because the politics need to change. Today was the global strike. Worldwide, millions of students, including us, did strikes for a better climate in their future. Strikes were in about 120 countries and 1,623 cities. I hope you did join the demonstrations too. The recent FFF report on biodiversity states that 1 million species are likely to go extinct within the century unless drastic actions is taken by countries.
Now that you know a bit more about what happened this week, we will move on to today's topic. You will learn the basic facts about climate change, but let's focus on our first question. What is climate change?
Climate change isn't actually a rare phenomenon. In fact, it has already happened several times throughout the Earth's history, because this term simply refers to the rough new global weather patterns, either colder or warmer, due to progressive changes in the Earth's climate. However, what makes it so alarming today are the reasons and the speed at which it is taking place. Because this time the causes are not natural processes, but human activities, and it is happening faster than ever before. However, climate change is not limited to the variation, in our case the rise, of the temperatures, but it includes all sorts of modification caused by it, from ice melt to shifts in plant blooming times. Since 1900, temperatures have increased by between 0.8 and 1.2 degrees Celsius, according to IPCC Special Report 15. And this progression is not likely to stop, even if we drastically cut down our emissions.
But why are the temperatures rising so fast? And what is the main cause of climate change nowadays?
The main causes of climate change. This is a quite obvious question, to which the answer is surprisingly complex. This is because we have to take into account the interaction between natural processes and human action. It is easy to get lost in all those phenomena: greenhouse gases, methane, acidification. Most of us might hear a lot about them, without realizing what they really are. One of the most frequently mentioned phenomena is the greenhouse effect. The image is pretty fitting. Imagine a regular greenhouse from which the heat can't escape, allowing the plants inside to grow and develop even during the roughest winter. Now replace it with the earth, that needs this warmth to allow all its inhabitants to live. It doesn't sound that bad, does it? Now imagine you add heaters inside the building, except their controls are broken, which leads the temperature to rise constantly. The plants will inevitably die because of the asphyxiating heat. This is exactly what is happening to the planet right now. And scientifically, here's how it works. Some gases, unsurprisingly called the greenhouse gases, are present in the atmosphere. The amount of those determine how much of the sun's heat will be trapped into the atmosphere or reflected back into space. And what are the gases involved in this process? Among others, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, the concentrations of all three having significantly increased since the Industrial Revolution. And the numbers keep rising. For instance, CO2 levels in 2017 were 28% higher than those measured in 1958. Now let's focus on this well-known gas, carbon dioxide. Although it is not the one with the highest heat-trapping power, the nitrous oxide we have mentioned before is nearly 300 times more effective at it. It is the gas that has contributed the most to the greenhouse effect, as a consequence of its high concentration in the atmosphere, that has increased by roughly 40% since the 18th century. The most notable example of a CO2 releasing activity is obviously fossil fuel, oil, coal, gas burning, which brings us the difficult challenge of getting rid of those energy sources to which our society seems to be enslaved. Methane is mostly released because of intensive breeding. As the number of animals raised for meat, eggs, and dairy grows, so do the methane emissions. Only for the US, the numbers of animals killed for human consumption already reached 10 billion, without even including fish, who also endure severe overfishing. Just imagine how much that represents in the entire world. This activity also causes deforestation. Since the livestock has to be fed, acres of forest are cut down for it, and forests are essential to absorb CO2 and incredibly helpful to slow down climate change. Intensive breeding can also contribute to soil pollution by increasing the amount of phosphorus, nitrogen, and other compounds which are nefast to the soil quality when they're found in such big quantities. Intensive agriculture is also negative for the environment and biodiversity. Since the human species has started to grow their own food, the number of elements consumed has been constantly reduced. There is a fewer variety of crop, and the few ones we plant are grown in monoculture fields. Additionally, they are genetically modified and watered with pesticides. Irrigation also consumes insane amount of drinkable water. This without any doubt destroys the soil balance and diminishes cultivated areas. Furthermore, organic and mineral nitrogen fertilizers commonly used create nitrous oxide, an extremely strong greenhouse gas which also causes acid rains. The Earth's albedo, meaning reflectivity or how much sunlight is absorbed or rejected by the Earth in the science jargon, could also influence climate change. This variable is affected by diverse factors such as ice and land cover, cloudiness, pollution. If the Earth was fully covered by forests, it would absorb 5 times more sunlight than if it was covered by ice. And now we notice a real reflectivity loss in several places of the globe, particularly in the North Pole. Why is this happening? Because as the greenhouse effect becomes more important and temperatures rise, ice caps melt. This inevitably leads to a change in the Earth's albedo, as space precedently covered by ice is now covered by oceans that are way more absorbent. It is a vicious cycle that is worsening and accelerating the impacts of climate change.
Even just to hear those facts, one can get really worried. But how does it actually affect our environment?
In 2015, we broke a record. It was the hottest year that had ever been recorded. This is nothing to be proud of. These warm temperatures caused heat waves of extreme violence, killing around 2,500 people in India alone. Hundreds of wildfires burned through Canada, British Columbia, and Siberia, destroying hectares of forests and forcing thousands of people to leave their homes. This should have alerted governments and the populations that something was wrong. They should have put all of their determination, money, and time into a project to slow down climate change and to reduce the amount of fires, hurricanes, heat waves, and other natural disasters. But nothing happened. And today, we can see that the amount of destruction and deaths did not decrease. It has been estimated that global warming can cause up to 300,000 deaths a year. And even though the global temperature is rising in every part of the world, the impacts are not the same according to the different regions. See, the subtropics like South Africa, Southern Asia, the Mediterranean regions, and Southwest USA that are already dry will become even drier, while equatorial regions and subpolar latitudes, which are very wet, will become wetter. This is due to the fact that because the temperatures rise, the atmosphere can hold even more water vapor. That way, water is evaporated in the subtropics and then can rise to very high latitudes before touching the ground in the form of rain or snow. This will create recurrent, violent, and murderous droughts and water scarcity that will engender environmental problems. Animals and plants will die, and there will be an erosion of soils that will make them less fertile. This will have an economic impact because farmers, for one, will not be able to cultivate crops and vegetables, and because of this, it will also affect many industries. For instance, with farmers not being wealthy enough to buy equipment, industries that sell farming machines will not make as much money anymore. This in turn will affect countries' economies. Finally, there will be many social problems, one of the main being the rapid spread of diseases. For one reason, due to the consumption of use of water that's not clean. Hunger will become an even more important problem, causing many deaths. This will cause anxiety, leading to water wars and to migrations. Heavy waterfalls are already and will continue to engender floods and hurricanes, costing a lot of money to governments that need to construct or reconstruct large parts of towns and cities, and affecting the lives of many people that will lose their houses and sometimes even their lives. This will cause similar consequences as droughts. The catastrophes will mostly affect developing countries, whose populations are the least responsible for climate change.
Okay, so let's think about it for a moment. What would you say if you woke up one day and you found out that the Statue of Liberty lied underwater, its torch barely visible above the water? What if the entire city of Miami was submerged by the ocean?
Even though it sounds like a trailer of a dystopian movie, this frightening scenario could soon become reality. Arctic glaciers indeed contain most of the Earth's water. They are formed by snow and ice anchored to the ground, but also by huge platforms and icebergs floating into the sea. Every glacier has a life cycle. Snow produced by precipitation is accumulated and compressed to form new ice. This ice slowly travels towards the sea and it finally melts, becoming water. Usually, the amount of snow that melts is balanced by the new formed ice. so the extent of the glacier doesn't change over time. However, if the average temperature rises, the glacier will melt faster than it recreates, and it will produce a lot of surplus water, causing a rise in sea levels. Indeed, Greenland alone has lost 739 gigatons. A gigaton is 1 billion tons of ice since 2000, and 30% of it came from one of its main glaciers, the Jakobshavn. If Thwaites, a huge glacier in Antarctica, started melting at the same rate Jakobshavn is, it would make the sea level rise of 3.30 meters before stabilizing again. Whether this will happen or not depends on the temperature of the air and the water surrounding it in the first place, but also on how much it will rain on it, forming lakes on its surface, slowly carving the ice. Consequently, if the overall temperature rises, more and more ice will melt, and the oceans will keep rising. If seawaters rose above the actual level, they would destroy in the first place coastal habitats, which would be affected by severe floodings and eventually disappear under the sea. As a matter of fact, in the past 25 years, oceans have been rising 3 millimeters per year, endangering many coastal species and causing severe humanitarian emergencies due to floodings. If these effects were to worsen, the daily routine in most of the world's coastal cities would radically change. People would be forced to move to more elevated areas as their homes would be no longer habitable, and many historical monuments would risk to disappear forever. Additionally, salt water would contaminate more easily freshwater streams, and the water supply available for agriculture would decrease drastically. However, sea levels can rise for other reasons. Water expands when it's hotter, so an increase of its temperature causes an increase of its level. Additionally, warmer waters would endanger the survival of several marine species who need cold waters to be able to live or disorient whales in their migrations. Finally, melted ice causes waters to be less dense, slowing down the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a massive stream of hot water, warming up the oceans surrounding the UK and Scandinavia. A decrease in its speed would endanger deep sea ecosystems relying on it, and lead to colder winters and heat waves in summer, causing problems to the people living in these regions. On the whole, even if temperatures don't rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, sea levels will rise of approximately 77 centimeters. It is therefore crucial to find solutions to protect coastal habitats and cities before it is too late. Indeed, several main cities are endangered by sea level rise. Jakarta is sinking 25.4 centimeters per year. Bangkok could be underwater within 15 years. Just 20 centimeters of sea level rise could make homeless 740,000 people living around Nigeria. Houston is sinking 5 centimeters per year, and even London could be affected as its area is already lowering because on Earth's crust movements, and this natural effect could be worsened by the ocean rise.
Now, let us paint a picture for you. A picture about what the future looks like for animals. There is a polar bear, crouched, hunted, poisoned, uncomfortable, on the merest lump of an iceberg. Uncomfortable, hungry, desperate. It has no chance of survival. The sea ice that it used to be around, it is no more there. And with its melting, the last ray of hope was lost for this majestic creature.
It's an image that you've probably come across before, and yet it does a remarkably good job at communicating emotively and effectively just how dangerous climate change can be for other living creatures beside ourselves. We keep on hearing about the million species projected to go extinct because of climate change, with terms like ecological collapse, Anthropocene, and Armageddon popping up again and again and again in the news. But if we zoom in a little closer to find out exactly what is going on out there, things become a little clearer. First of all, why are these warmer temperatures hurting animals? I mean, it's not like the hippos are going to run out of sunscreen or the oceans suddenly run dry. To be clear, we're not talking about huge changes to our planet. Yet. but small things add up. Coral bleaching, for example, is one thing that has been reported a lot in the news, and it's a pretty worrying phenomenon. Half of Australia's Great Barrier Reef is dead, having failed to recover from the repeat bleaching events over the past few years. And yet, with coral reefs being the quote-unquote rainforests of our oceans, this means thousands of animals suddenly losing their homes. Sticking with our ocean theme, phytoplankton, tiny little marine creatures, are following a similarly worrying downwards trend. 40% of our world's phytoplankton has been lost in the past 60 years. And if that doesn't worry you, it should. Phytoplankton do literally everything, from creating half of the air you breathe to bringing about the clouds that give us rain. To be supper for all of the fish that millions of people around the world eat. Don't you think that that's important? There are countless examples of how rising temperatures are endangering the lives of animals, none of which we have time for today, sadly. So instead, let us give you a brief list of a few notable cases. The breathtaking 500-kilometer migration of monarch butterflies from Canada to Mexico every year has almost disappeared, with butterfly numbers falling from 1 billion to 35 million in the space of a few decades. And the populations of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and fish have all dropped by 60% since 1970. Whilst this is because of all kinds of factors, it includes habitats becoming unsuitable with changing conditions, food chain collapse from lower insect numbers, human-animal conflict brought about by farming challenges, and all of it relates back to climate change. And the bramble K. melomys recently went extinct. It's an Australian rat-like mammal, and it lived on an island in the Great Barrier Reef, but it was sadly eliminated by rising sea levels, which flooded its habitat, making it the first mammal to go extinct due to climate change.
As you may know, the main demand of the demonstration of Fridays for Future and School Strike for Climate is the demand to the governments to keep the 1.5 Paris Agreement. But what does actually happen to the Earth if we do not meet this agreement? What will be the different futures look like? Though scientists aren't quite sure when the point of no return is reached and how the different futures are looking like, we tried our best to find out what different futures could happen when we do not meet the 1.5 agreement.
The Paris Agreement calls for us to keep the temperature increase under 2 degrees Celsius, or even better 1.5 degrees Celsius. Even in the best case, if we were somehow able to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius, the catastrophic effects of climate change will be felt around the world. Food production centers will be the most affected, and millions could starve. 1/3 of the world, especially in the subtropics, will lose access to fresh water. This will cause a migration of climate refugees numbering up to the millions. For comparison, the last time Earth was this warm was 6,000 years ago, and the entire American Midwest, which currently produces around 10 billion bushels of grain, was a barren desert. A less optimistic goal is 2 degrees Celsius. By this temperature, their 2 billion and rising population will be barely able to survive the heat. Permafrost will melt in mountains and cause landslides, destroying entire cities. In 2003, the summer was 2.3 degrees Celsius warmer than usual, and 52,000 people in Europe died from heat. An average temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius will likely result in summers that are 6 to 10 degrees Celsius hotter. At this temperature, 40% of the Amazon forest will die, even without human deforestation. 125,000 years ago, Earth was 2 degrees Celsius warmer. The sea level back then was 6 meters higher. By some estimates, that would result in 10% of the world's population being displaced. It is also worth nothing that sea level rise does not happen at a uniform rate. In fact, it is major population centers that are impacted the most. Take the jet stream, for example. It involves warm water near the equator, flowing north past the North American east coast up to the Arctic, where it cools down and sinks, sliding along the ocean floor to lower places like near Europe. It's the cooling and sinking motion that brings warm water away from the east coast. With the Arctic temperatures rising fast, the cooling action will slow down, and instead of the entire jet stream halting, what will happen is that the warm water will stagnate near the east coast, making the sea levels there rise twice as fast as the global average. This will affect major cities like Miami, New York, Washington D.C., Boston, Quebec City, Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto. In fact, many of these cities are already experiencing the effects. In Miami, the water regularly comes up into the streets during high tide. And in Canada, many cities have declared a state of emergency due to flooding, which the national government about to follow suit in declaring a climate emergency. There's a good reason that the goal was kept at 2 degrees Celsius. 3 degrees Celsius is the universally agreed point of no return, after which climate change will cause more climate change. By this temperature, plants will no longer be able to sustain photosynthesis at a higher rate than cellular respiration, therefore releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The temperature of the soil itself will rise, speeding up the process of dead trees rotting, which will release even more greenhouse gases. When temperatures were this warm 3 million years ago, there were no land glaciers. This would result in the rivers drying up, and salt water will flow upstream, poisoning water supplies, even groundwater. Agricultural yield will decrease 10% for every degree of increase in temperature after that, coupled with the fact that huge swaths of fertile land become arid when they are flooded with salt water. In Europe, temperatures could reach 45 degrees Celsius during summer. The need for air conditioning puts more stress on electric generation, and hydroelectric sources will cease to work because of lack of water. The Siberian permafrost areas are places where the soil is frosted even in summer, will melt, releasing the carbon dioxide stored inside. Even more horrific is the possibility of viruses from millions of years ago, to which we have no protection from, being released. The entire population of Siberia could be wiped out. Anything past 3 degrees Celsius sounds like a horror story. At 4 degrees Celsius, 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide will be released from the permafrost, pushing the world's temperature up of about 5 degrees Celsius. Methane hydrate reserves under the ocean will rise to the surface in violent explosions when the water warms, releasing methane, a greenhouse gas 30 times more effective than carbon dioxide. There are no precise estimates on how much of these reserves there are, but scientists believe there are enough to create a scenario that would remind you of hell. Methane is highly flammable, meaning that if there's a high enough concentration of it in the atmosphere, the smallest spark could set the entire planet on fire.
So let's come to a rather selfish question. How is climate change affecting us?
Let's pretend for a moment that we were the only living species on Earth. Let's imagine that our well-being was our only aim and that our actions affected exclusively us. It isn't too hard to do, right? Now, let's forget about biodiversity, plants and animals, and focus on what global warming means for us. While some populated areas will turn into a dry, hot desert where no kind of human life is possible, others will be covered by water. As a consequence, people will be losing their homes and will be forced to leave their countries, and the number of environmental migrants will rise exponentially. For instance, it's estimated that by 2050, from 25 million to 1 billion people will have to move out of their countries because of extreme climate phenomena. Where will these people go? Will they be able to carry on with their lives? Or perhaps not. We really can't answer these questions. The most that we can do right now is try to eliminate the reasons for their migration. And if the migrations weren't enough of a reason to worry about our own future, we also need to consider climate change's effect on public health. Extreme heat waves during summer severely affect children's health as they dehydrate more easily than adults. Consequently, children mortality would increase. Additionally, several diseases would spread more with higher temperatures. All diseases caused by infected water, such as diarrhea, become deadlier with a warmer climate, and others, such as those carried by mosquitoes, would be able to be transmitted in larger areas. Consequently, more people would get sick each year and risk their lives. More people getting sick means that it would cost more to heal them, and so the economy would suffer. Additionally, research has shown that climate change worsens economic inequality between countries. Poor countries only become poorer, while rich countries, at least for a while, become richer. This happens because climate change mainly affects agriculture. Farming becomes impossible if the land turns into a desert or is flooded. Rich countries don't base their economy on farming, so they are safe, but underdeveloped countries, which often rely on it, can only see their wealth decrease. However, as temperature increases, also fully developed economies will begin to suffer. Floods and fires will damage homes and infrastructures which would have to be repaired, and emergency-related costs will increase. Additionally, in presence of some extreme effects of climate change, such as desertification, lack of fresh water and torrential rains, coping with them would be very difficult from an economic point of view. In the end, not only will climate change affect nature and biodiversity, but it will also endanger any human life on Earth.
Okay, sorry if we ruined the mood here. This is sad, but it is the truth. Now that we've looked at the problems, let's look at the solutions to slow down climate change.
Now it's time for a question. How big are your feet? Your footprint rather. It's a simple enough question, and yet within it lies the simplest answer to how we can turn back the clock and stop climate change in its tracks. An ecological footprint is a measure of how much a person demands from their environment in the form of material goods, services, and shelter. The result is a value which represents how much land that person would need to sustain themselves in producing all the raw materials for this lifestyle. Currently, the world, on average, is using far more stuff than we could possibly hope to produce with the space we have available in a sustainable manner. In fact, the global footprint is equivalent to the space of 1.6 Earths. Even factoring in the billions of people who don't have the wealth to own a phone or laptop, who haven't caused these problems with overconsumption, and yet who have to face the consequences even so. Ultimately, it is only by reducing our ecological footprint that we can fix this problem.
Our podcast is now coming to an end. We're sorry for the quality at some points and promise this will get better each episode. We hope you enjoyed it so far. In the second episode, next week, we will take a short look at how we can reduce our ecological footprint, and maybe we will find some scientists for future who help us proving our point. If you do want to get our script and within our sources, you can find them at our social media accounts and YouTube under Youth Climate Podcast. As well, we encourage you to strike with local groups next Fridays again. And props how great the 24th of March turned out. We will keep fighting. If you want to join this podcast and you're a student, just write us a mail at internationalyouthclimatepodcast@gmail.com. See you there. And thanks for listening. Stay tuned. Justice!